Every wild animal is born with one simple rule: stay away from humans. Ire that rule, and you usually don't get a second chance. That's why what happened next shouldn't have happened at all. An injured elephant, weakened by a poisoned arrow, didn't disappear into the African wilderness. She walked toward people, not because they found her. She found them. At first, that sounds like a remarkable story about one unusually intelligent elephant. It isn't. Over the years, rescuers have documented dolphins swimming up to divers while tangled in fishing gear. A wild fox approaching strangers with its head trapped inside a glass jar. A whale remained perfectly still while humans cut ropes wrapped tightly around its body. Different continents, different species, completely different lives. Yet somehow, they all made the same impossible decision. They moved toward the one creature evolution should have taught them to avoid. So what changed? Did these animals suddenly stop fearing humans? Or are we misunderstanding what was really happening in those final desperate moments? Because the answer isn't just surprising. It completely changes the way scientists think about one of the strangest behaviors ever recorded in the wild. And it begins with an explanation that almost everyone accepts. Until the evidence starts falling apart. The obvious answer seemed almost too easy. Maybe these animals weren't asking humans for help. Maybe they were simply returning to someone they remembered. If a previous encounter had ended well, coming back in another emergency would be a perfectly logical survival decision. For years, that explanation sounded convincing, until the evidence refused to stay that simple. An elephant with no known history of human rescue. A dolphin approaching divers it had never seen before. Other cases involving species separated by millions of years of evolution. Different habitats, different lives. Yet the same impossible decision kept appearing. One story could be dismissed. A few stories might be coincidence. But dozens of similar cases? Now the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. And that's when the original theory began to fall apart. Scientists realized they had been focusing on the wrong thing, not the animal's past, but the split-second decision it made when every other option was disappearing. If memory couldn't explain that decision, what could? The search for that answer would lead to one of the most extraordinary partnerships ever discovered between humans and a wild animal. If personal memory wasn't enough to explain the mystery, scientists needed a completely different kind of evidence. They found it in one of the most unexpected animals on Earth. A small African bird called the honey guide. Unlike most wild animals, it doesn't simply tolerate humans. It actively seeks them out. Not because it needs protection, because it needs a partner. The honey guide can locate hidden beehives with remarkable precision. But it can't break them open. Humans can. So the bird deliberately calls, waits, and leads people to the hive. Once it's open, both sides benefit. People collect the honey. The bird feeds on the wax and larvae left behind. For scientists, the real discovery wasn't the honey, it was the decision. The honey guide had recognized a unique human ability, then changed its own behavior to take advantage of it. That was the first clear evidence that cooperation between humans and a wild animal could be intentional rather than accidental. It proved that another species could treat humans as problem solvers instead of threats, but that still couldn't explain the original mystery. The honey guide approaches humans to find food. An injured elephant approaches humans when every other chance of survival is disappearing. Cooperating for a reward is very different from asking for help when you're about to die. At first, the honey guide looked like a rare exception, but scientists stopped treating these as isolated stories and began comparing behavior across species. That's when the pattern began to emerge. A dolphin trapped in fishing nets moving toward divers instead of away. At first, it looked like confusion or panic. But then more cases appeared. A wild fox injured and disoriented, slowly approaching humans without aggression. A whale tangled in ropes, remaining still while humans removed them. An elephant separated from its herd after injury, moving closer to human settlements instead of deeper into the wild. Different species, different intelligence, different environments. But one condition kept appearing in every case. When control over survival collapsed, direction of movement changed. Toward humans, not away. At first, each case could still be explained on its own. But when scientists combined all available data, explanations started to break apart because this wasn't random behavior. And it wasn't learned behavior either. Many of these animals had no prior peaceful contact with humans, no memory to rely on, no experience to build from, Nothing that could explain a consistent response. And it wasn't simple cooperation either. Cooperation implies intention and strategy, but this looked more automatic than deliberate. Something was triggering the same response across completely different species, and at that point, both earlier explanations failed at the same time. What once looked like scattered incidents was starting to resemble a rule, and that forced a completely different question. Not what animals think about humans, what survival pressure does to decision-making across species. Why does collapse always produce the same direction of choice? By this point, the pattern no longer needed more examples. The question was no longer what was happening, it was why it was happening. And the answer may not be what scientists originally assumed. Because there is a fundamental problem with the idea of trust. Trust requires experience, manner, and repeated safe interaction. But many of these animals had none of that. So what if this was never trust at all? What if the animals weren't choosing humans because they felt safe, because every other option had already failed? In extreme survival situations, behavior changes, not toward comfort, but toward the least dangerous available choice. A wounded animal doesn't evaluate perfect solutions. It evaluates remaining ones. And sometimes humans are simply the only visible system capable of changing the outcome, not because they are trusted, but because they are accessible. This reframes everything. The honey guide wasn't cooperating out of understanding. It was exploiting a biological capability. And the animals in distress weren't seeking help in the human sense. They were responding to a collapse of alternatives. A survival trade-off happening in real time. Not emotional, not symbolic. Just selection under pressure. And once this idea takes hold, entire mystery stops being about humans and starts being about survival itself. But that conclusion raises something even more unsettling, because if this is true, then the final moment of decision is far more universal than anyone expected. At the beginning of this story, the behavior seemed impossible to understand. An animal moving toward a human when every instinct should tell it to escape. It looked like trust, or confusion, or something breaking inside nature itself. But now, after everything we've seen, the picture looks different, because the animal was never acting against its instincts. It was acting through them. When survival is stable, distance is the safest choice. But when everything falls apart, distance is no longer an option that guarantees survival. In that moment, every system narrows down to one thing, not comfort, not familiarity, but probability, the chance that something, anything, might still change the outcome. And in some cases, that chance leads toward humans. Not because humans are safe, but because they are present, because they are capable of intervention. Because they represent one of the few unpredictable forces left in the environment. So what looked like an extraordinary bond was actually something much more universal. A final calculation made under pressure so extreme that instinct itself becomes flexible, and that changes how we see the entire story. The animal was not choosing trust. It was choosing the last remaining gamble. And when you return to that first image, no longer looks mysterious. It looks like a system reaching its final limit. And in that limit, survival still finds a way to decide, even when every option is almost gone. If this made you see animal behavior differently than before, hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. Comment below what surprised you the most, the pattern itself or the explanation behind it. And if you want more stories that change the way you think about nature and survival, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.